4 weeks after taking back the reins of ruling Afghanistan, the Taliban's interim government faces big tests of its ability to govern. There have been reports of a supposed power struggle among the so-called pragmatic and ideological Taliban leaders over the makeup of the new quote-unquote government. The Taliban have denied this. They did say they are willing to have good relations with other countries, but no nation has recognized the Taliban government yet. So what steps could the Taliban take to rebuild the country, and what will it take to improve international relations? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on the discussion, joining us in Washington, Junaid Ahmad, Director of the Center for Global Dialogue and Professor of Middle Eastern Politics from University of Lahore in Pakistan. In Chapel Hill, Klaus Laris, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Beijing, Zhou Rong, Senior Analyst from Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start by asking you, Mr. Ahmad, 1 month already in Kabul. Has the Taliban's performance so far satisfying to you?
Whether it's the Taliban or any other political actor, coming in the conditions that it did, one can't expect much more this quickly from any political actor coming into power, satisfying, as I was saying, all of these various interests, domestically and internationally. So taking that into consideration, I think they've done okay.
All right. Professor Laris, what about your take?
Well, I'm not quite sure if they've done okay, because we hardly know anything about the new government. It's an interim government. We know the various people who occupy various government positions, but we don't really know much more. What we have found out recently is that there seems to have been a clash between a more hardline Taliban faction and a more moderate diplomatic faction within the Taliban. And I don't know whether they have gotten their act together, whether in the end a compromise was achieved, or whether they are still kind of fighting each other. So we will find out soon. But the Taliban are faced with fundamental tasks. The economic situation is very bad. The humanitarian situation is bad. There's pressure from outside on the Taliban government, whether or not they should be recognized. And there, of course, are very complex relations with the neighboring countries, including Pakistan and many others. So I think the tasks they are faced with are totally enormous.
I think it is very hard right now. Still, does not indicate there's a forming of the inclusive government. And currently, they try to say they would like to protect the women's rights, but right now, they do not like women to go to school, and they do not have the pragmatic policy. And this, of course, they said they would like to educate some women in certain kind of condition, but actually to practice that, like all the grassroots region to implement their promises, it's very hard. And the women may have their rights to go to the school and go to university, but right now they feel very harsh.
Okay. Mr. Ahmad, I saw your public speeches in a way trying to argue for the Taliban. Let me just ask you, we have several lines. One is so-called the older guards vis-a-vis the younger generation, and the other is so-called the more religious and more rigid faction of the Taliban vis-a-vis the more diplomatic one, more negotiate with the West branch of the Taliban. Mr. Ahmad, I remember our conversation weeks ago when Taliban just went into Kabul, and you said, quote unquote, the so-called new Taliban. Now, do you still stick to your words, or there are different lines of observations to look at that organization?
No, I think that anyone that is familiar with what the Taliban was in the 1990s and what it is today, even if one considers the one right now with some hardline views, they're still worlds apart. Whether it's, and I think that we have to be very careful. Sometimes these these binaries that we construct, whether it's the moderates versus the hardliners
it's
or
not
the old
accurate.
guard, new guard. Yeah, these binaries are not helpful at times in actually understanding what's going
So
on.
what is
I think
helpful? So what is helpful?
Yeah. Well, I think that what is helpful is many of the Taliban leadership and others who have been groomed, say, sitting in Qatar, but also, interestingly enough, by other countries in the region that we don't know much about, certainly Pakistan, but perhaps also from Russia, from China, and so on. So there's many Taliban who have been engaged and so have a sense of how to kind of respond to the concerns of the international community domestically in Afghanistan. And of course, there's many others who have not had that exposure, who've not had that. So I think that's much more of a useful way of understanding how the Taliban movement is now adjusting to this new situation that it finds itself in.
Is it adjusting, Professor Laris, from your observation?
Well, I think one can say that the Taliban so far haven't proven to be as bad and disastrous as many have feared, but they haven't proven to be as inclusive and as modern and as liberals as many have hoped. They're somewhere in between, and we still don't know where it's going, which direction it's going, back to the 1990s or forward into a more liberal or more moderate future. That remains to be seen. And I think the next few weeks will certainly tell us an awful lot about that. At the moment, of course, it's the economic problems in the country and the starvation and the draft and all these hunger and poverty problems. These are the problems the Taliban have to deal with.
At this point, Professor Laris, I follow up because the international community has now recognized the Taliban. The UN got $1.1 billion pledge of humanitarian aid and also 606 million emergency aid, so-called flash appeal already. But now it is still a process as to several things. One, whether it's going to be distributed and in cooperation with the Taliban or not, even though they're in power, they're the one very much need to coordinate with the United Nations, and the UN also need their support in order to get the humanitarian aid to the Afghans. Second is about whether they're going to really guarantee the security of the humanitarian process and the personnel in the process. And third is that whether the Taliban are trustworthy if it is really becoming part of the process of getting the humanitarian aid to the common Afghans, that there will not be much corruption, there will not be, putting the humanitarian aid to military use or for Taliban use alone. So a lot of different layers of observation that it seems that Taliban has to testify to the international community, Professor Laris.
Yeah, that's a good analysis. And of course, there's a great deal of suspicion and mistrust about the Taliban. And that is quite justified because we don't know them. We only know their past record, and the past record is very bad indeed. So foreign governments and the United Nations and other aid organizations are very hesitant to give all that aid money, $1 billion and more, as you said, to the Taliban government or interim government as such. They want to make sure that the money actually gets onto the ground, to the people who really need it. They don't want to give it to some possibly corrupt minister who puts it into a bank account in Switzerland so that the people of Afghanistan don't benefit. If the Taliban
By the way, just to be fair, we also heard about the corruptive cases involving earlier officials with the Republic of Afghanistan, just to be fair.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. You can say almost everyone in Afghanistan has been highly corrupt who had to deal with money. And I think once the Taliban have proven that they can be trusted, that the money will be spent on the Afghanistan people and infrastructure and these kind of very useful economic measures, then I think aid deliveries will probably come more directly to the Taliban as such. And regarding recognition of the Taliban, that is of course also an instrument to force the Taliban to do the right thing. It's a kind of carrot which is being dangled. So if the Taliban prove to be moderate, prove to be reliable in that respect, then they can also be recognized.
Professor Joe Rohn, though, we have seen governments not officially recognizing Taliban, but a lot of governments are trying to approach the Taliban interim government, quote unquote, including China, Russia, Qatar, you know, many, Pakistan certainly, and many others in the region, and also Germany, for example. The foreign minister of Germany was talking about there might be possibility of reopening the embassy in Kabul, which the Taliban has been repeatedly calling for to the foreign governments. But how do we see this kinds of, you know, testing water approach made by various governments who used to have very different relationships with the Taliban?
I think most important things, everybody have seen Taliban is making progress. There's no slaughter. The social order is still calm. And everybody think that we should do our best to help Afghani people. So many countries wanted to recognize the Taliban region, but they have to wait first Taliban's image. The second, Taliban's recognition is whether Taliban region is illegitimate. What the impression for that is whether the government will be inclusive or not. But anyway, we all see the progress made by Taliban. They cannot build a new country with isolation from international community. They need help and they need urgent international aid. So let's wait and see. Trying to see more progress made by Taliban rather than more retreat from Taliban.
Mr. Ahmad, given the information you have, is the Taliban putting forward any specific benchmarks, timelines, deadlines for achieving specific goals?
Right. I mean, I think this has two angles to it. One is certainly, I mean, I think this is expected now of the Taliban. I mean, they've, of course, formed their interim government. Many people are critical that it's not inclusive enough, certainly of different ethnicities as well as of women and so on. And people are still testing the waters to see, you know, what exactly will their program and plan will be.
So you're saying, Mr. Ahmad, that the Taliban has already met the first benchmark, which is to form, quote unquote, an interim government. Yet, in that benchmark, they have not achieved others' expectation of being, quote unquote, inclusive and open. Is that what you're trying to say?
Right. I mean, well, again, I mean, and their response is, well, this is an interim government, which brings me to the second part of what I'm saying is that, you know, when the Taliban even entered Kabul and the presidential palace, I mean, they were actually expecting that they're going to be negotiating with some government that still exists there. It was, even they were surprised that they took over the country and became basically the rulers of the country so quickly. So on the other hand, we also have to concede that perhaps the Taliban themselves need some time to think through exactly how they're going to proceed further. I mean, and right now, the overarching issue is the humanitarian issue in the country. So it's not only dealing with all of these specific interests and the constituencies that have their interests, but also with the overarching economic crisis in the country.
Professor Zhou, is that also your impression, what Mr. Ahmad is trying to say?
Taliban is trying to distribute the medicine as well as the food to the common people, which the previous government have not done. Taliban is making progress. And what I think a pressing thing is to just attract some people, that is the people who leave the country, who are educated, who are skilled for the people, come back from overseas and try to help Taliban to govern the country. Because right now, Taliban need talent so much.
But that comes to an interesting question. If you are not inclusive at the top, how would the people trust you to come back, right? So it's an interesting cycle that we're talking about. It's not about doing one thing at a time, but rather doing several things, all at a time.
Yeah, I think there's a conflict within Taliban ranks because some people said, oh, the new government should be more inclusive. But some said, no, we should just give over advantage to the people who just combat harshly toward, against America. So that is, there should be differences. So that's why the inclusive government up to now has not been made right now. So that I think it will take some time, give Taliban more time to just adjust within their ranks. So that will be better.
Okay, Professor Laris, your thoughts.
Yes, I think the proof is in the pudding, really. If the Taliban achieve competency and efficiency and show competency and efficiency by making sure that the electricity keeps on, that the banking system is working again, that water is there to be drunk, that the population isn't starving, that enough food gets into the country, that the Harvard, which hasn't been destroyed so far, can still be brought in and is there to be used, that aid deliveries are efficiently distributed and get to the people who really need it. If all that, if they can prove all that, so prove to be efficient and competent, I think then they stand a very good chance of being recognized by the international community. And I think that is fair. If the Taliban prove to be competent and efficient, and not the Taliban of the 1990s, and to also show a more inclusive government, more, let's say, a more liberal, modern government, if that is the right term in connection with the Taliban, the international community will recognize that and will also reward them for it.
Right.
So I think really the ball is in the court of the Taliban. They simply have to be shown to be competent and efficient and not to embark on infighting, which paralyzes any government in the world.
Mr. Ahmad, the Taliban has been talking from day one that any arrangement will be in accordance with the Sharia law, which of course is the ultimate document that the Taliban originally, when it was established, the core document in mind. And now it's likely to be continuing. But the question is how to interpret it. We also see Sharia law being very much respected in many other countries and by many different social groups. So the interpretation of it is becoming ever more important. Now, Mr. Ahmad, given your knowledge, how much leeway do you see within the Taliban history and its makeup today that interpretation and new implementation of the Sharia law will be like?
Right. I mean, I think that the Taliban government, like all other Muslim regimes that particularly rely on this idea that the republic or the country's laws must be in compliance with the Sharia Islamic law or the prophetic practice and so on. For example, even the Taliban now, we know that when it was in power in the 1990s, it did not allow women to go to school. And despite whatever complications that exist now, it is at least verbally said that girls will be able to go to school and up to university and so on. So clearly they have reinterpreted something in order to make this change. So this is it's always a process of contestation, and it will be a process of contestation and pragmatism within the Taliban itself.
Professor Lares.
Yeah, I think the big question is how pragmatic will the Taliban be, or how ideological will they be? And I think that is a question which we can't answer now, but the next few weeks and months will say that. And we all hope that the Taliban will go down the pragmatic road and do not stick to that ideologicism which many in the West and in the rest of the world fear. But we can't be sure right now.
Professor Joe.
Yes. I think the interpretation of Sharia varies in one way or another, because we can take one thing, for example, Malaysia also have the 3 northern states. They also implement the Sharia law. But I think the real implementation is very different from what people think. Even ideology can also be explained one way or another. So we can hardly say Taliban may have enough flexibility to implement the Sharia law, cannot strictly implement the previous orthodox, previous ideas, theories of Sharia law. They may have more flexibility, and they will explain their flexibility. Why? Because it is best for to govern the country, rather than it is just damage the country. Damage their rule by just implementing strictly the Sharia law. I think that they don't have enough flexibility.
How should we compare now Afghanistan, 1 month after Taliban went into Kabul and took control mostly of the country, compared to the 20 years of Afghanistan, which at times apparently were peaceful, but under foreign occupation mainly, or a government that has been supported by foreign occupation. I think this is a ever-evolving question, and there will be ever-evolving answer, but I'm really curious about what is your answer now?
Well, the big advantage now is that the war is over and that Afghanistan, for the first time essentially for almost 20 years, is largely at peace and that there's no wartime situation. And that is appreciated by the Afghanistan people, particularly those in the countryside where, of course, most of the fighting took place, where most of the killing took place. This is an enormous advantage, and the Taliban should make use of that and become more pragmatic, as we discussed. However, some of the achievements of the last 20 years, what we call a civil society, including the rights of women, the rights of journalists, the rights of many diverse groups in Afghanistan, that, of course, was also an achievement which doesn't need to be overlooked. And the Taliban will find it difficult to maintain these achievements, but I hope that not all of these achievements will be dismissed and forgotten about, that some can be maintained.
Professor Zhou.
Yes, I think the most remarkable progress for Taliban is made the whole country calm. The social order calm, there's no chaos, no further conflict. So this is a progress they made. But also some other things which have not made progress. That is to say, just to give more rights to women and just to give more liberty, more freedom to the common people. I think right now they need some time to make some progress.
Mr. Ahmad.
Yeah, I think that I'll echo this idea that we shouldn't underestimate the desire, the excitement of ordinary Afghans at peace in the country, in a context where there's been perpetual conflict, particularly outside of Kabul in the countryside. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate that at all. And I think that that's where some of the goodwill comes from, and even the so-called resistance led by Ahmed Shah Massoud's son and others. One of the reasons why it doesn't seem like they're getting much traction is because, again, people are not interested in further violence and further conflict right now. They are giving the Taliban a chance in this setting to perhaps advance the country forward, maintain some of the as Professor Lars was saying, some of the hard-won gains that they have, and so on. But again, this is a work in progress, and hopefully it'll work for the better.
We hope it is a work in progress. Thank you so much for all of you. Junaid Ahmad, Klaus Laris, Zhou Rong. Thank you, gentlemen.